Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about this idea more generally that we're seeing come up again and again and again with protected areas in general, including wilderness areas. Lucan's talked about it a bit in the reading. Obviously, you did that other reading, how the idea of wilderness was invented without indigenous people, right? There's multiple ways this came up this week, and I want to touch on it now a little bit as well. So wilderness, we use that sometimes to talk about the idea of an untouched wilderness, just like in the Wilderness Act that the US has, where it talks about the idea of a community of life untrammeled by man, right? So this idea of sort of nature apart from humanity, where humanity is not a serious presence. And of course, as anthropologists, we recognize that that's kind of problematic in a lot of ways, including that there are very few landscapes that haven't been actively involved by human beings that haven't been actively, to some degree, have a human presence on them, right? Generally speaking, habitable space has been to some degree inhabited. A good example is the Amazon. We sometimes think of the Amazon rainforest as one of those like last sort of untouched frontiers of biodiversity, right? We think of groups living in the area perhaps as isolated. We think of the Amazon itself as relatively pristine, other than at the edges where it's being destroyed. And yet the Amazon itself, recent research suggests, such as a study by Tersteg et al. Called Hyperdominance in the Amazonian Tree Flora, suggests that the Amazon rainforest has been being shaped by humanity all along. This study found, and we hesitate to, put all our eggs in one basket and come to a sweeping conclusion based on one study, but there's been more than one that have come to similar conclusions. But what this study found was that there's 16,000 Amazonian tree species, but only about 1 to 2% of those account for about 50% of the trees, some of which have a lot of human use. They're trees that humans use for food or for material for building. So the implication of that, of course, and one study does not prove a huge conclusion, but the implication of that, and something that researchers are looking more into, is that perhaps there are pretty major chunks of the Amazon where indigenous people who were doing small-scale farming or other activities were actively shaping and leaving behind different looking forests, right? We think of horticulture slash and burn as kind of, people burn it, they crop it, they raise a farm there, then they leave it and it grows back normal. But perhaps what we're seeing is actually that in some cases it more grows back, or that things have been kind of shifted in a way, not that's not natural, it's still natural species that are from the area, but certain species were sort of affected by humans in the sense that we've got a lot of a certain species that humans like, or a lot of 200 species that humans really like. So humans have been shifting the quote unquote natural balance, and one could argue, if we've been there for thousands of years, that we are part of the natural balance of the Amazon, and that to kick indigenous people out of that space for protected areas is a little bit missing the point, or rather profoundly missing the point. And it's here that maybe how we think about ecosystems might need some reframing. If you're not familiar with the history of the science of ecology, back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of ecologists thought in terms of what we would like basically a closed ecosystem model, a Clementsian ecosystem model. You don't need to know the fancy words for it, but the idea that there's certain pieces that have got to be there for that certain ecosystem, and if any one of them gets taken out, the whole thing starts to fall apart. There is some truth to that. There are species, we sometimes call them keystone species, that if you remove, everything starts to fall apart. Like an American alligator in the Everglades, because they make depressions that make little swamps, or like a beaver in a lot of northeastern woodlands. But what we've learned since the 60s is that a lot of ecosystems have more of what we'd call a dynamic equilibrium, or more of a resiliency kind of system, basically meaning that, yes, there's sort of a stable arrangement of species that work well together, but also sometimes change happens, like a little forest fire affects part of the land or something, and then other things grow back in, and the things that grow back in might be a little bit different than what grew in back then. It'll be some of the same stuff, but also some perhaps a little different stuff. Basically, that there's a certain amount of flexibility worked into nature already, and that it's not quite as fragile as we once thought. And if that's the case, it starts to help us understand how a place like the Amazon can have plenty of human presence and still be working perfectly fine as an ecosystem. There's some flexibility built into the system, flexibility that humans have been able to make use of and kind of find themselves a niche within, where they can live there, do well, yes, affect the ecosystem, but not affect it in a really negative way, allow the forest to still flourish and be a forest.